Naomi Carter only wanted to surprise her husband on their wedding anniversary. She wore a simple blue dress, carried a box of pastries she had baked with her own hands, and walked into the glass tower where her husband served as chief executive officer of one of the largest technology companies in the country. She had rehearsed the moment in her mind the entire drive into the city, imagining the look on his face when he saw her standing in the lobby. But before she could even say his name to the man at the front desk, the head of security looked her up and down, then turned and pointed toward a beautifully dressed woman stepping out of the elevator. "That is the CEO's wife," he said, his voice carrying easily across the marble floor. A ripple of laughter moved through the lobby. Naomi stood perfectly still for a moment, her heart folding in on itself, and then she smiled, turned around, and walked back out into the rain. No one in that building had any idea that within a few short hours, the very man they worked for would make every single one of them answer for what had just happened to his wife. For 10 years, Naomi Carter had lived a life that most people would never suspect belonged to the wife of a billionaire. She drove a modest gray sedan with a small dent in the rear bumper. She shopped at the same grocery store near her apartment every Sunday morning, greeted the same cashier by name, and paid for her groceries with a card that revealed nothing about the fortune attached to her marriage. Her husband, Marcus Carter, was one of the most recognized entrepreneurs in America, a man whose face had appeared on the covers of business magazines, whose keynote speeches were quoted in classrooms, whose net worth was estimated in the billions. And yet almost no one outside their closest circle knew that the woman he had married more than a decade earlier still lived like she had before any of the money existed. It had not always been this way by accident. In the earliest days, when Sterling Tech was nothing more than 2 folding tables and a stack of second-hand computers inside a rented garage in Queens, Marcus and Naomi had built the company together, side by side, sharing exhaustion and instant noodles and the kind of hope that only 2 people in love and completely broke can share. Naomi had written the very first lines of code that would eventually become the backbone of the platform that made Marcus famous. She had stayed up through countless nights debugging systems, while Marcus drove across the city trying to convince investors to take a chance on 2 young people with nothing but an idea and a stubborn belief in each other. When the company finally began to grow, when the offers and the headlines and the attention started pouring in, Marcus made a decision that Naomi never once questioned. He told her, quietly, one evening after a long day of meetings, that he wanted the world to respect her intelligence and her work, not the fact that she happened to share his last name. He did not want her identity reduced to a title. He wanted people to see her the way he saw her, as a brilliant engineer, not as a decoration standing beside a powerful man. So they made a quiet agreement. Naomi would remain outside the spotlight. She would keep her freelance engineering work, take on her own clients, build her own small reputation under her own terms, away from cameras and headlines and the endless curiosity of strangers. Marcus, in turn, promised that no matter how large the company grew, their marriage would remain something sacred, something untouched by the machinery of public image. For years, that promise held. Reporters occasionally speculated about the mysterious woman rumored to be his wife, but Marcus never confirmed details, and Naomi never sought attention. It worked, mostly because both of them wanted it to work, and because at the center of their careful arrangement was something neither of them had to explain to anyone, a love built long before either of them had anything to prove. Their friends, the few who knew the full truth, sometimes teased Naomi about the strangeness of her situation, joking that she was probably the only woman in America married to a billionaire who still clipped coupons out of habit and drove 2 hours round trip to visit her mother every other weekend. Naomi always laughed off these comments, though there was something quietly deliberate in the way she clung to those small rituals. She had watched other founders' spouses get swallowed by the machinery of wealth, their identities rewritten overnight into something glossy and unrecognizable, and she had promised herself early on that she would never let that happen to her. She wanted to remain the same woman who had once eaten cold noodles at 2 a.m. while debugging a server crash, not because poverty had ever been romantic, but because that woman, stubborn and capable and unimpressed by titles, was the one she trusted most. Marcus, for all his public confidence, carried a quieter insecurity that few people ever saw, a fear that the empire he had built might someday convince the world, and even convince Naomi herself, that his success belonged to him alone. He knew better than anyone how much of Sterling Tech's foundation had come from her mind, her code, her sleepless nights beside him in that garage, and some part of him resented how easily the public narrative had erased her from the story, simply because she preferred to stay out of photographs. He told himself, year after year, that there would eventually be a right moment to correct the record properly, publicly, on his own terms, in a way that honored her, instead of merely mentioning her name in passing. He did not yet know that his hesitation, however well-intentioned, was quietly building toward a moment of reckoning neither of them could fully anticipate. But secrecy, no matter how well-intentioned, has a way of leaving room for other stories to grow in the space it creates. As the years passed and Sterling Tech's profile rose higher, the company brought in new executives, new faces, new voices to help manage its growing empire. Among them was a woman named Vanessa Brooks, hired as vice president of marketing, sharp, polished, and undeniably skilled at her job. Vanessa attended nearly every public event alongside Marcus, since managing his image had become part of her professional responsibility. Photographers captured them together at galas, at press conferences, at ribbon cuttings for new offices across the country. It did not take long before whispers began to spread through business circles and society pages alike, whispers that assumed Vanessa Brooks was the woman married to the famous chief executive. Marcus never spoke publicly about his marriage at all, and in his silence, that assumption was allowed to grow unchecked, season after season, until it had planted itself so deeply that almost no one at Sterling Tech questioned it anymore. On the morning of their anniversary, none of that history was on Naomi's mind. She woke early, humming quietly in her small kitchen as autumn light filtered through the window, mixing batter for the pastries Marcus had loved since the very first year they were together, back when neither of them owned an oven that worked properly and she had to borrow one from a neighbor down the hall. She packed the box carefully, checked her reflection once in the hallway mirror, and told herself she was being silly for feeling nervous about surprising her own husband. She had not visited his office in years, not because anything was wrong, but because their life together had simply settled into two separate rhythms, his in-glass towers and boardrooms, hers in quiet rooms filled with code and coffee. Today, she decided, she wanted to close that distance, if only for an afternoon. She wanted to walk into his world and remind him, and maybe remind herself, of where they had started. The drive into the city took longer than she expected because of the rain, a light autumn drizzle that clung to the windshield and blurred the skyline into something almost dreamlike. She parked 2 blocks from the building because the garage beneath it was reserved for executives, and she did not think to mention who she was to anyone in advance. That, in hindsight, would become one of the most painful details of the entire day. She had never needed to announce herself before. She had never needed anyone's permission to be exactly who she was. Walking those 2 blocks in the rain, holding the pastry box against her chest to keep it dry, she felt something close to joy. The simple anticipation of seeing her husband's face light up the way it always did when she appeared somewhere he did not expect her to be. The lobby of Sterling Tech's headquarters was the kind of space designed to remind visitors of exactly how much money surrounded them. Marble floors stretched in every direction, polished so thoroughly that the gray autumn light bounced off them in soft sheets. A massive glass sculpture hung suspended above the reception desk, and behind that desk sat a young receptionist whose posture suggested she had been trained to evaluate people within seconds of their arrival. Naomi approached with a warm smile, still slightly damp from the rain, the pastry box balanced carefully in her hands. "Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, her eyes moving quickly over Naomi's simple dress and flat shoes. Naomi laughed softly and shook her head. "I am family," she said. "I am here to see Marcus." The receptionist's expression shifted into something polite but unconvinced, and she asked Naomi to wait while she checked the visitor list. A security guard nearby, a heavyset man named David Coleman, who had worked at Sterling Tech for nearly 8 years, stepped closer to assist, scanning a tablet in his hands. "Your name is not listed here, ma'am," he said, his tone courteous but firm. The tone of a man who had turned away dozens of overeager fans and reporters trying to sneak past the front desk over the years. Naomi tried to explain, gently, that she did not need to be listed, that she was Marcus Carter's wife, that surely someone could simply call up to his office. But before David could respond, the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby slid open, and Vanessa Brooks stepped out, dressed in a tailored ivory coat, her heels clicking against the marble, with the unmistakable confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was standing. The entire lobby seemed to shift in her presence. Employees near the reception area straightened instinctively, a few offering small nods of greeting, the kind reserved for someone whose approval mattered to their careers. David Coleman, without a second thought, gestured toward Vanessa and spoke the words that would echo in Naomi's memory for the rest of that day. "That is the CEO's wife right there," he said, loud enough for the small crowd near the desk to hear, his tone almost proud, as though he were correcting a stranger's honest mistake. A young intern standing nearby let out a short, surprised laugh, quickly covering her mouth, though the sound had already carried. Someone else murmured something about mistaken identity. Naomi felt the warmth drain out of her chest in an instant, replaced by something cold and disorienting, a feeling she would later struggle to describe to anyone, even herself. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice or demand to be taken seriously. Naomi Carter had spent her entire adult life learning the particular strength required to hold her composure in rooms that underestimated her, and this moment, humiliating as it was, called on every ounce of that strength. She simply nodded once, said nothing more, and turned toward the door. The rain outside had grown heavier, and she stepped back into it, without an umbrella. The pastry box still clutched against her chest, now slightly crushed from how tightly she was holding it. Behind her, the lobby returned to its usual rhythm within seconds, as though nothing unusual had happened at all, as though a woman had not just been erased from her own life in front of a room full of strangers. Naomi sat in her car for a long time, before she turned the key in the ignition, watching rivulets of rain trace paths down the windshield, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily, and she did not cry now, though her hands trembled slightly against the steering wheel. Her mind moved instead toward questions, cold and clinical, the same instincts that had once helped her debug impossible lines of code under enormous pressure. Why would a security guard, someone employed to know the basic facts of the company he protected, so confidently identify another woman as the wife of the man she had been married to for over a decade? Why had Marcus never corrected the rumors that clearly circulated through his own building? And why, of all people, had it been Vanessa Brooks stepping off that elevator at exactly that moment, dressed like she belonged in a headline? Memories rose unbidden as she sat there in the parked car, memories of the garage in Queens with its flickering fluorescent lights and its smell of burnt coffee, memories of the two of them curled together on a second-hand couch reviewing spreadsheets until 3 in the morning, memories of the year everything nearly collapsed, when their first round of funding fell through, and they had survived on savings and sheer stubbornness for 11 brutal months. She remembered the night Marcus had come home so exhausted from rejection after rejection that he had simply sat on the floor of their tiny apartment and put his head in his hands, and how she had knelt beside him and told him they would find a way because they always found a way. She remembered believing, with absolute certainty, that whatever they built together would always belong to both of them equally, in spirit if not always in title. She remembered, too, the smaller moments that never made it into any magazine profile of her husband, the quiet Tuesday evenings when Marcus would come home and read code over her shoulder just to feel close to the work again, the way he used to call her his secret weapon in front of early investors, before quickly correcting himself and calling her his business partner instead, worried even then about how the world would receive the truth of what she meant to the company. She remembered the birth of their only daughter, born during the same month Sterling Tech secured its first major contract, and how Marcus had missed the signing ceremony entirely because he refused to leave the hospital room, choosing her and their child over a moment that would have made headlines. Those memories did not feel like the memories of a man capable of quiet betrayal, and yet doubt has a way of reshaping even the gentlest history into something suspicious when the present offers no other explanation. Sitting there now, soaked from the rain, staring at the glass tower that bore her husband's success, Naomi refused to let herself spiral into assumptions she could not yet prove. She was an engineer at heart, trained to gather evidence before drawing conclusions, and she decided, with the same steady resolve that had carried her through years of uncertainty, that she would find out the truth quietly, on her own terms, before confronting Marcus with accusations she might later regret. She would not call him screaming. She would not demand answers over the phone. She would watch, she would listen, and she would understand exactly what had been happening inside the walls of the company she had helped bring into existence before she decided what to do about any of it. Over the following days, Naomi allowed herself to observe from a careful distance, telling no one, including her closest friends, about what had happened in that lobby. She began paying closer attention to the business coverage she usually skimmed past, searching archived photographs and recent event coverage with the same patient thoroughness she once brought to lines of broken code. What she found only deepened the ache in her chest. Vanessa Brooks appeared beside Marcus in photograph after photograph, at product launches, at charity dinners, at industry award ceremonies, always positioned just close enough to suggest intimacy, always dressed as though she understood the role she was playing, even if no one had officially given her that role. In several captions beneath older articles, Vanessa was referred to outright as the First Lady of Sterling Tech, a nickname that had apparently followed her for years within certain social and business circles. What troubled Naomi most was not the existence of these photographs themselves, since she understood that publicity required Marcus to appear at countless events with colleagues and staff. What troubled her was the silence. Marcus had built an empire on precision, on carefully worded statements, on messaging so controlled that entire departments existed solely to manage what the public understood about Sterling Tech. Surely a man capable of shaping global perception with a single press release could have corrected a rumor about his own marriage if he had ever wanted to. The fact that he never had, the fact that the misunderstanding had been allowed to calcify into something the entire company seemed to accept as fact, felt to Naomi like its own kind of confession, whether Marcus intended it that way or not. She found an old interview, nearly 3 years old, in which a journalist had asked Vanessa directly about her relationship to the company's founder, phrasing the question in a way that clearly assumed romantic involvement. Vanessa's answer, printed word for word in the article, never actually confirmed anything, yet it never denied it either, drifting instead into vague language about closeness and partnership and shared vision that left every reader free to draw their own conclusion. Naomi read that answer 4 times, searching for some hidden clarity that might ease the growing knot in her stomach, and found none. She closed her laptop that night, unable to decide which hurt more: the possibility that her husband had allowed this confusion to protect his own convenience, or the possibility that Vanessa had cultivated it deliberately, brick, for reasons that had nothing to do with love at all, and everything to do with ambition. During this same period, Marcus called her more often than usual, his voice warm and slightly distracted through the phone, mentioning that he was buried under preparations for something significant happening soon at the company, something he could not fully explain yet, but promised would matter to both of them. Naomi let most of his calls go to voicemail. It was not cruelty that kept her from answering, but a need for space, a need to gather herself before she trusted her own voice, not to shake with the questions she was not yet ready to ask. Each unanswered call added another small layer of distance between them, though Marcus, consumed by whatever preparations he was managing, did not seem to notice how unusual her silence truly was. It was David Coleman, of all people, who unknowingly handed Naomi the next piece of the puzzle. A few days after the incident in the lobby, Naomi returned to the building, not to see Marcus, but to quietly observe the rhythms of the place that had wounded her so deeply. She found herself near the security desk during a slower afternoon hour, and David, recognizing her face from the earlier encounter, approached with visible discomfort, offering an awkward apology for what he called a simple misunderstanding. Naomi accepted his apology, with more grace than he probably deserved, and in the easy relief of being forgiven, David began talking more freely than he likely should have. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the entire building had been buzzing for weeks about an enormous announcement Marcus was preparing, something tied to a very important woman connected to the company's history, something meant to be revealed at the upcoming gala that half the executive floor had been working around the clock to organize. Naomi thanked him politely and walked away with her pulse hammering in her ears. Every fragment of information she had gathered over the past several days seemed to be arranging itself into a single, devastating shape. A major announcement, a special woman tied to the company's history. Preparations Marcus refused to fully explain. Photographs of Vanessa Brooks standing beside her husband for years, unchallenged, unexplained, quietly accepted by an entire organization as simple fact. It was not difficult, in that moment, to imagine the worst. Naomi began to believe, with a heaviness that settled deep in her chest, that Marcus intended to finally make his relationship with Vanessa public, perhaps even to end their marriage in some carefully staged, carefully worded announcement designed to protect his image while destroying everything she had quietly built her life around. The night of the gala arrived. Wrapped in a kind of tension Naomi had never before associated with anything connected to Marcus. She debated for hours whether to attend at all, torn between the instinct to protect herself from further humiliation and the equally powerful need to finally see the truth for herself with her own eyes rather than through secondhand rumors and half-formed suspicions. In the end, she chose to go, arriving quietly, dressed simply, choosing to stand near the back of the grand ballroom, rather than approach any of the tables reserved for executives and their families. The room glittered with chandeliers and champagne and the particular kind of confidence that only enormous wealth can manufacture. Reporters lined one side of the hall, cameras ready, waiting for whatever Sterling Tech had promised would be a historic announcement. When Vanessa Brooks appeared on the small stage, set up at the front of the ballroom, wearing a deep emerald gown that caught the light with every movement, a wave of applause moved through the crowd. The evening's host, a well-known business journalist, hired to MC the event, introduced her warmly as the woman who had stood beside the chief executive through every major milestone of the company's recent history. Naomi felt the words land like small stones against her chest. She watched Vanessa smile out at the audience with practiced ease, watched the way she accepted the introduction without a flicker of correction, and Naomi understood, with painful clarity, that whatever was about to happen, Vanessa herself believed she was walking toward a moment that belonged to her. Naomi noticed small details that seemed to sharpen her dread with every passing minute. The way event staff addressed Vanessa with a familiarity, usually reserved for family, the way a young publicist adjusted the hem of Vanessa's gown backstage with the practiced efficiency of someone preparing a bride, the way even the seating chart near the front of the room placed Vanessa at the table nearest the podium, a position Naomi understood, from years of watching Marcus organize similar events, was always reserved for the person closest to him. Each detail landed like another small stone added to the weight already pressing against her chest, and by the time the lights dimmed for the evening's formal program to begin, she had almost convinced herself she already knew exactly how the night would end. Marcus stepped onto the stage a few moments later, and the ballroom fell into an immediate, expectant hush. He looked exactly as Naomi remembered him from the earliest photographs of their life together. The same steady posture, the same quiet intensity in his eyes, though tonight that intensity seemed sharpened by something Naomi could not quite name. He thanked the crowd for their patience, acknowledged the years of speculation that had followed him and the company, and then paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for every camera in the room to lean forward in anticipation. Naomi, standing near the back wall, with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, felt her heart breaking in advance, preparing itself for whatever confirmation was about to arrive. Marcus lifted the microphone and spoke slowly, deliberately, choosing each word as though he had rehearsed this exact moment countless times in the quiet of his own office. For 10 years, he said, people have asked me the same question over and over again. Who really built Sterling Tech? The crowd murmured softly, unsure where this was leading. Marcus continued, his voice steady, despite the weight clearly pressing behind it. Tonight, he said, I want to finally answer that question honestly, because I have let a mistake go uncorrected for far too long, and it has cost someone I love more than she should ever have had to pay. Behind him, the enormous screen mounted above the stage flickered to life, and the entire ballroom turned its attention upward. The first image that appeared was grainy and old, clearly taken more than a decade earlier, showing a cramped garage lit by a single fluorescent bulb, wires trailing across a folding table, and a young woman hunched over a second-hand computer, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her eyes fixed intently on lines of code glowing across the screen. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She recognized that photograph instantly, because she was the one standing in it. Marcus turned toward the image, and then back toward the crowd, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. This is the person who wrote the very first version of the software that built this entire company, he said. This is my wife. Her name is Naomi Carter, and she is the true co-founder of everything you see around you tonight. A stunned silence swept through the ballroom, so complete that for a moment even the clinking of glasses seemed to stop entirely. Cameras swung wildly, searching the crowd for the woman Marcus had just named, and somewhere near the front of the audience, Vanessa Brooks stood frozen, her polished composure cracking visibly across her face, as she realized, in real time, along with everyone else in the room, that she had never been the woman Marcus intended to honor tonight. Naomi remained near the back wall, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears finally breaking free after days of holding perfectly still, as every head in the ballroom turned to search for her. Marcus stepped down from the stage before anyone could stop him, moving through the parting crowd with a single-minded urgency, his eyes fixed on the woman standing near the doors, the woman he had spent a decade protecting from a spotlight he never fully understood the cost of. When he reached her, he did not speak at first. He simply took her hand, gently, the way he had taken it on their very first date more than 15 years earlier, and led her forward through the crowd, back toward the stage, back into the light he had kept her out of for far too long, while the entire ballroom rose to its feet in a slow, uncertain wave of applause that grew steadier with every step they took together. Later that evening, once the cameras had been dimmed and the guests had been asked to give the family a private moment, Marcus finally explained everything to Naomi in full, his voice raw with an honesty he rarely allowed himself in public life. He told her that he had never once stopped believing their agreement to keep her out of the spotlight was the right choice, because he had wanted so desperately to protect the peace she cherished, the ordinary life she had built for herself away from cameras and speculation. He admitted, with visible shame, that he had underestimated how deeply the assumption about Vanessa had spread through the company, how a simple silence on his part had allowed an entire false narrative to take root and grow unchecked for years. He had never encouraged Vanessa to accept the role of unofficial First Lady, but he acknowledged, painfully, that his own inaction had made it possible. Vanessa Brooks, for her part, offered no real denial when confronted the following morning in a private meeting with Marcus and the company's board of directors. She admitted quietly that she had known for years how the rumors benefited her professionally, how being perceived as close to the chief executive's personal life had opened doors within the industry that her talent alone might not have opened as quickly. She had never directly claimed the title of his wife, she argued, but she had never once corrected it either. And in the world of image and perception that she herself had built her career upon, that silence was its own kind of choice. One board member asked her directly whether she had ever considered how the rumor might affect the real woman standing behind Marcus, and Vanessa's answer, quiet and honest, for perhaps the first time in the entire meeting, was that she had simply never allowed herself to think of Naomi as real at all, since she had never once been introduced to her in 10 years of working alongside Marcus. Marcus listened to her explanation without visible anger, though the decision he made afterward was swift and absolute. Within the hour, Vanessa Brooks was formally removed from her position as Vice President of Marketing, her access to the building revoked before the end of the business day. Word of what had happened at the gala spread through Sterling Tech's offices with startling speed, and by the following morning, Marcus had called every department head into the largest conference room the company owned, a room usually reserved for board meetings and major investor presentations. He stood at the head of the long table, his expression calm but unmistakably serious, and told the assembled leadership that what had happened to his wife in their own lobby was not a small mistake to be quietly forgotten. It was, he said, a reflection of something deeper, a culture within the company that had allowed appearance and assumption to matter more than basic human respect. He informed them that the head of reception responsible for questioning Naomi's identity that day would be dismissed from her position, and that David Coleman, despite his years of loyal service, would face formal disciplinary action for publicly and confidently misidentifying a guest based on nothing more than her clothing and her demeanor. More importantly, Marcus announced a new company-wide policy that would take effect immediately, a policy stating clearly that every visitor to Sterling Tech, regardless of how they were dressed, how they carried themselves, or what assumptions any employee might be tempted to make about their status, would be treated with equal courtesy and respect at every single entry point of the company. He explained that no employee should ever again be permitted to determine a person's worth or importance based on outward appearance, because the woman who had built the very foundation of their success had once looked, by every outward measure that mattered to some, like nobody important at all. Finally, standing before the entire assembled leadership of the company he had spent a decade building, Marcus offered a public apology to Naomi, his voice steady, even as it visibly shook with emotion, acknowledging that his silence had allowed her to be humiliated in a building that existed only because of her own hands. The new policy was not simply a memo circulated through internal email and quickly forgotten, the way so many corporate announcements tend to fade within a week of their release. Marcus insisted that every employee, from the newest intern to the most senior vice president, complete a short training session on the subject, one built not around legal liability, but around a simple question he wanted every person at Sterling Tech to carry with them. What if the person standing in front of you, whoever they appear to be, turns out to be someone whose contribution you cannot yet see? He had the reception area redesigned within the month, removing the raised platform that had always given the front desk staff a slightly elevated view over incoming visitors, a small architectural choice that had unconsciously reinforced a hierarchy nobody had ever intended to build, but that had shaped behavior for years regardless. It was a small change, almost invisible to anyone who did not know its origin, yet it became, within the company, a quiet symbol of everything that had shifted since that rainy autumn afternoon. Naomi, invited to speak after Marcus finished, did not raise her voice or demand punishment for anyone in the room. She stood quietly at the front, her presence commanding attention not through volume but through the simple, unmistakable dignity she carried with her into every room she had ever entered. She told the gathered executives that she held no interest in seeing anyone lose their livelihood out of spite or revenge, that firing people out of anger would not undo what had already happened to her, and would not on its own change anything meaningful about the culture that had allowed the moment to occur in the first place. What she wanted instead, she said, was something far simpler and far more difficult to legislate. She wanted every person who walked into that building, whether they arrived in a designer coat or a rain-soaked dress carrying a box of homemade pastries, to be treated as though their presence mattered, because it always did, whether anyone recognized it in the moment or not. The room fell into a silence heavier than any applause could have been, and several executives, including David Coleman himself, lowered their heads in genuine, unguarded shame. In the days that followed, Marcus made one final gesture that mattered more to Naomi than any policy change or public apology could have on its own. He asked her to return with him to the very lobby where the entire painful chapter had begun. The same marble floor, the same glass sculpture hanging overhead, the same reception desk where she had once been so casually dismissed. He walked beside her slowly, holding her hand the way he had at the gala. And when they reached the center of the lobby, surrounded by dozens of employees who had gathered quietly to witness the moment, he introduced her again, this time with none of the confusion or misplaced identity that had defined her first visit. He told them simply that they were meeting the true co-founder of Sterling Tech, and that she was also, and had always been, the only wife he had ever had or ever wanted. The employees gathered in the lobby broke into applause that felt entirely different from the polite, distracted clapping of the gala, something warmer and more sincere, rising from people who finally understood exactly who had been standing among them all along. David Coleman stepped forward first, his expression humble, and offered Naomi a formal apology in front of his colleagues, admitting that he had let assumption replace observation and that he deeply regretted the pain his words had caused her. Naomi accepted his apology with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the entire ordeal, choosing forgiveness not because the offense had been small, but because holding on to anger had never once been part of who she was. Vanessa Brooks, meanwhile, cleared out her office within the week, leaving quietly through a side entrance, away from cameras and colleagues alike, carrying with her the uncomfortable understanding that her own ambition had ultimately cost her far more than it had ever given her. By the time autumn deepened into its final weeks, the story of what happened inside Sterling Tech's headquarters had settled into something closer to legend among the employees who remained, told and retold in break rooms and hallway conversations, though never again with the careless cruelty that had once colored the version starring Vanessa Brooks. Marcus and Naomi chose, in the end, not to change the fundamental rhythm of their private life together. Naomi did not suddenly step into the spotlight as some public figure attached to her husband's fame, and Marcus did not ask her to. What changed instead was smaller, quieter, and in many ways more meaningful, a renewed understanding between two people who had built something extraordinary together long before the world ever noticed either of their names. In the weeks that followed, Naomi found herself returning to the office, more often than she had in years, not as a spectacle or a headline, but simply as herself, sitting quietly with the engineering team on the 14th floor, offering suggestions on a project that reminded her, in the best possible way, of the earliest lines of code she had written in that cramped garage so long ago. The younger engineers on the team, many of whom had joined the company long after its founding, treated her with a kind of quiet reverence once they understood who she truly was, though Naomi worked hard to put them at ease, cracking jokes about outdated programming languages and insisting they call her by her first name rather than any title at all. She never asked for an office with a view or a seat on the board, and Marcus never pushed her toward either, understanding by now that whatever recognition she wanted, she would choose for herself, in her own time, on her own terms. On the evening it all finally settled, Marcus and Naomi left the glass tower together, as the autumn rain returned, softer now, falling in a gentle mist across the city streets. They did not speak much as they walked, and they did not need to. Marcus reached for her hand the same way he had reached for it years earlier in a rented garage full of second-hand computers and impossible dreams, and Naomi let him take it, her fingers curling around his with the same easy trust that had carried them through every difficult year before this one. Somewhere behind them, the lights of Sterling Tech's headquarters glowed against the darkening sky, a monument built on code she had written and belief they had shared, and neither of them looked back to see it as they walked forward together, into the wet evening streets, two people who understood, finally and completely, that a marriage worth keeping was never built on recognition or applause, but on the quiet, unshakable decision to stand beside each other, especially in the moments when the rest of the world failed to see the truth standing right in front of them.